Hi, I'm Dave Bundy, editor of the Lincoln Journal-Star, and this is the Journal-Star editorial board endorsement interview with James Michael Bowers. He is a city council member running for re-election in District 1, which is the northeast part of Lincoln. James, thanks for joining us today. Before we turn this over to you and let you do most all the talking, we'll let everybody else in here introduce themselves. Natalia, you want to get us started?
Yep. Hi, James. Natalia Witta. I'm president of the Journal-Star.
Mike?
Mike James, new member of the board, community member.
Kent. Nice shirt, Kent.
Hey, James.
Hey.
Kent, welcome.
You gotta do better than that, man.
Well, this is like not the first time we've ever talked.
I know, but we can act. It's acting. Go ahead.
And I cover arts and entertainment and have been on the editorial board for 12 years, I think, something like that.
We better do the math. You always ask that like a question.
Well, I got to figure out when it was.
All right. So first question for you, James, will probably be a familiar one to you, and it'll be interesting to see your answer. You, as a current council member, you know the joy and pain of being a public servant. So why do you want to continue as a city council member? And then what experiences and attributes qualify you or will help you perform in that role?
No, I appreciate that question. Northeast Lincoln deserves experienced leadership on the city council. I passed several ordinances and initiatives with bipartisan support, and it's a broad portfolio of things that I've been able to get done on the council. Our city council, especially as we're seeing a turnover of folks on our council, it's important now more than ever that we have folks that know how to get things done, know how to make lasting policy, and know how to build coalitions to deliver results. My long-term civic involvement and my proven track record of delivering results, I think qualifies me for re-election. In addition, I went to our public schools, I've served on multiple nonprofit boards here, I've opened a business, and I've made my life in Northeast Lincoln. I understand District 1. I've lived here my entire life, and I've delivered a lot of results for the city and for District 1 in Northeast Lincoln. And additionally, leading through the crisis of COVID really was a crash course in decision-making, and I'll be able to use that experience forward to deliver results for our city, my district, and my constituents.
All right. What do you think are the biggest issues that are unique to your district? And then what do you think are the biggest issues for the city as a whole?
So I think some of the things that apply specifically to District 1 would include, with District 1 having a pretty diverse group of folks in my district, it's important that we continue to be accountable and transparent to everyone in the district. This, of course, applies citywide. But one of the things that I'm most proud of is I'm the only elected official that holds consistent monthly town halls for my constituents and for residents in District 1. There's a lot of folks that, as we have experienced increasing polarization in Northeast Lincoln being a good representation of the city as a whole, it's important that we continue to build trust and show that we can all work together. In addition, some of the things that I think would apply would be continuing to make Lincoln safer. I think that we need to increase recruitment efforts for the Lincoln Police and our fire department and stuff that we've already done in my time in office and expanding on that. And then also by supporting small businesses and making sure that we prevent brain drain, right? Making sure that everyone in Lincoln and folks in Northeast Lincoln can achieve their dreams by opening a business if they want, being able to have a good paying job, and by being able to live in a home or wherever they would like to, whatever kind of housing that they would like to live in, and making sure that that's available. One of the ways that we can do that is by making sure that we take care of our infrastructure and making sure that we have policies in place that really continue to attract and retain folks in our city. In addition to the public safety, I've earned the endorsement of the Lincoln Police Union and the Firefighters Union, which I think also demonstrates my ability to build pretty strong coalitions. So those are some things that I think that the city and specifically my district should be taking on in the next term. One other thing before I forget is I mentioned housing, and some ways that we can do that is by increasing our housing stock, increasing the amount of places where folks can live at, and making sure that we rehab existing housing stock to really make sure that we, instead of just demolishing houses, we're able to rehab them and make them safe for people to live in, while also, as our city continues to grow, continue to grow our city.
Well, you sort of you stepped all over all the questions I was going to ask, but that's good. Now you can elaborate. The next question I had on our list was, and you're, as a council member now, you're privy to a lot of the efforts that are being made, but what are some of the things that still need to happen to address the housing stock, as you discussed, both affordable housing and then that missing middle type housing for working families?
So I think two different approaches, right? Like, as we continue to increase the housing stock and rehab the existing housing stock, right? So by rehabbing the existing housing stock, we need to continue to find dollars and programs to make those available to homeowners and to folks that are renting, right? I know that through the Lead Safe Lincoln initiative that the city's currently doing, we can see that there are houses in our city that have lead exposure. And it's really interesting when you mark over the houses that are at risk for lead exposure with the graduation rates of students in our public schools. It's really, really interesting to see how they overlap. And so by pushing forward programs like that, I think that that's really going to be key to making our houses safe, the existing houses safe, and to find success in rehabbing properties. Because currently what are happening to folks is they may wait because they simply can't afford it, right? So if we're able to do some of that outreach and provide some of those dollars, it could save money in the long run. In addition to that, we do need to build more, and we need to build housing at all income levels. I think one of the hiccups in that is that is a need that in our city, and I think that some folks may not necessarily agree that we have a housing shortage, and I think we see that with some of the responses that come in when developments occur. So one of the efforts that need to happen is we need to do a better job of providing the makeup of the consequences of having a housing shortage and how that's impacting Lincoln now. One way that I'm tackling that now is through my monthly town hall tomorrow. I'm actually doing a question and answer about tax increment financing. As we saw with the Lincoln Bold project, we got a lot of questions in and a lot of emails in, and a lot of people who care a lot about our city. But some of the nuts and bolts of how some of these policies work and the impact that it could have on the city was not necessarily easily understood. So I think the city needs to do a better job in providing information about what our housing situation is and buying some more public buy-in from folks in the current state of our housing supply.
Well, you did it again, James. My next question was about TIF. Ordinarily, tax increment financing is almost like NyQuil. It can just put you to sleep, but it's gotten folks' attention here, particularly with Lincoln Bold. So what do you think about the city's use of it? Is it being used correctly? Should it be used more, less, differently? What strategy should be employed?
So kind of like what I mentioned earlier is that when I'm able to have a conversation with folks, so folks wrote, I'll use Lincoln Bold as an example, right? Folks wrote in about Lincoln Bold, and I had really good conversations and really in-depth conversations with folks about what TIF actually is. I think that there is a perception out there that TIF is essentially the city writing checks to developers and struggling to get across that, that's not what it is. But once I'm able to have like an in-depth conversation with folks and be honest and say that, this took me a bit of time to understand, and I would not consider myself an expert, then folks are like, okay, this makes sense to me. And it's not just the city spending money on a development instead of spending that money towards roads or public transit. So having those conversations with people really have turned opinions. And it's hard to have a conversation about how to improve policy when there's such a misunderstanding about what that policy is, right? And so if we can't agree, not even that we can't agree on the facts, because once we have the facts, people do tend to agree. But once we can provide that information then is a starting point for, okay, well, if this is what TIF really is, if tax refinance, if this is what it really is, then the conversation then can move towards, is it being used too much? Is this a place that would develop anyways? Or are there other things that should happen with TIF? For instance, there was the $700,000 that were going to go towards the Affordable Housing Fund. And once we were able to, it was hard to have a conversation about that $700,000 and what that should look and what that should be without kind of that base understanding of where those dollars are coming from. So my roundabout way in saying that is that, I think we need to continue to do the hard work of providing information and doing the outreach to folks to talk about what TIF is. And then that usually turns down the temperature. And then that provides a more factual place for what needs to occur with TIF in our city. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Next question. I think you managed to address this a little bit too, but perhaps you can go into more depth. What does Lincoln need to do to attract people and fill vacant jobs?
So there's a couple of different things that I think Lincoln can do to fill vacant jobs and to attract people into our city. And some of that is by growth, right? By making Lincoln an exciting place to live and to have housing options for them. With our housing shortage, we simply don't have the units available for folks to expand in Lincoln, or if they want to move to Lincoln, or if they want to say that this is why we need to have housing at all, increased housing at all levels, is so that way we can have more options for people who want to live here, right? And then in addition to that, looking for those ways to really grow our city and to make some really exciting things happen here. There's been talk about, the convention center coming here and making Lincoln a real hub of activity. And we've already seen some of this with some of the technology jobs that have come to Lincoln and came here in Lincoln. I think another thing that we can do is continue to work on workforce and making sure that folks have those opportunities available. This is something that I worked on the city council with my workforce ordinance that I was able to get through the council, and that was providing a way to incentivize businesses that have apprenticeship programs in their companies, and providing those credentials to those workers. So if we can work on the workforce so folks can have the job skills, if we can create housing at all levels so that way folks have a place to live, and if we can continue to grow Lincoln and to really keep Lincoln on the map, which that's the trajectory that we're on now, I think that's going to continue to make Lincoln an exciting place to be. And in addition, a place that folks want to, if they're coming in from the university, a place that they want to stay and not immediately jump ship to somewhere else. And I think that along with our policies that we push through, making sure that we push through policies that are representative of Lincoln values and representative of things that address issues that people want to address, and not picking battles that just take up time, resources, and create a lot of heartache and headache.
All right. Next question. So, and you've sort of touched on this one already too, about police staffing, but there've been a number of police issues. There are staffing needs as we've raised the pay to be more competitive with Omaha. There have obviously been a lot of reports about climate within the department and harassment and discrimination claims. And so what needs to happen with the police department to better ensure public safety? And that's not to imply we're not already safe publicly, but everybody's looking for ways to be a little better. So
yeah. No, so there's been this talk about the climate of the police department and the culture, the employee culture of the police department. And I think one of the ways to address that is by continuing to work on recruitment, right? Like if we have a shortage of folks that are applying to become officers in Lincoln, and reports that we've seen and things that folks have said is, the number of folks that are applying to be police officers have gone down. And so it's not as big of a pool as what it once was. Well, if we can continue to recruit from a big pool of folks who want to serve our community in this way, then that allows the city to find officers that will bring that culture and bring those values to the police department. And I think that will do a lot to address some of those concerns. If we're able to pick from that wide pool, we're able to hire the best and the brightest and the people that want to bring those kind of values to our police department. We have a good police force here. Like I said, I'm honored to have their endorsement, the police union's endorsement. And if we want to address what some of the concerns that have been brought up, making sure that we have a well-staffed police force with folks that have our values and Lincoln values and public safety in mind, I think is one way to address that. And we'll probably get results in a more long-lasting way. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
So I have one last question. It's that open-ended question. But before I do that, just want to see if anybody on the editorial board has a follow-up. And Kent leaned forward slightly in his chair. That's his body language that says he does indeed have a question. And then we'll see if Mike waves his hand. Mike's a hand waver. So Kent, what do you got?
Two things that kind of go back to the Lincoln Bold. One of the things that we heard a lot of the opponents were, we didn't know about this right in time. We didn't know this. And the same thing with the wilderness crossing or what out there in the southeast is, we didn't have notice. We weren't able to be part of the process early on. That seems to me to be a big problem on these development issues that needs to be addressed in some fashion. And secondly, on the TIF, do you think it's being used at the right level now, or too much, too little? Where do you see that right now and how it's being used?
Cool. So I'll address both those issues. I'll start with the first one about notice with folks with developments. One of the things that is concerning was when no one came to the Planning Commission for the Lincoln Bold project. And I think that is an example of how we do need to look at the notices that are given. I mean, I don't think anyone can argue with that, right? Like if some of the surrounding businesses and property owners and neighbors who had very strong feelings about this weren't even made aware that there was a planning commission meeting about this, then that is a concern. And I actually have an email out trying to figure out what are some solutions to that. And that's why at the public hearing on Lincoln Bold, one of the attorneys who was representing folks in opposition, he kind of ran through some of his concerns. And one of the questions that I asked him was there any law broken or was there any ordinance broken with notification? And essentially what I took from his answer was no. And I don't believe that we should move goalposts in the middle of a project, right? Like I don't believe in moving goalposts. I don't think that's a good way to do business. But I do think that does, so that's why I don't believe in moving goalposts, right? For that project or any project. But the fact that, so, I mean, because we've seen people go to planning commission meetings before on other developments where they felt where they felt passionately about, but for no one to show up to this one, I thought was really, really interesting. And it warrants further looking into what is the current process, who receives that notification. And I do think that is an example of where the city should not do just the bare minimum. And we need to look at how can we prevent that from happening again, because I do think that those concerns were legitimate, right? Like I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So that's the first one about notice. And I do have an email out trying to look to see like what what is the current process, who was getting left out, and why were those folks maybe not included, and is there something that needs to change to city code to make sure that folks aren't left out. Again, not necessarily that would have necessarily have alleviated everyone's fears or concerns, right? Like I don't necessarily think that if people had more notice that it would have gotten rid of their fears or their concerns. But I do think that that probably could have addressed some of the feelings of getting the short end of the stick or being intentionally left out, right? And those are two different concerns. Being intentionally left out versus like, you know, the concerns that they had about parking and density. Might not have fixed that, might not have even completely fixed that. But when no one's showing up to a planning commission meeting, I definitely get where they're coming from. So that's the first part of the question, right? Second part about TIF, is it being used appropriately? Is it being used too much? Is it being used too little? And I think in my opinion, as I'm seeing right now, I think it's probably being used about the appropriate amount of time. And the reason why I say that is we have folks that are still building and still developing and still seeking TIF and still being able to find outside funding sources, right? And I think that if folks were not able to build or rent out these units or you know, be successful in their endeavor, then I don't think that we'd be seeing as many requests for TIF. And in addition to that, there's a lot of folks that review this, you know, and I think that folks that have reviewed it have been doing their job and doing their due diligence. I do think that the concern, or one thing that needs to be addressed as a community is, and I've said this before, and I don't mean to, you know, belabor the point, but what exactly is TIF? And because in my experience, when I've talked to people and when I've explained what TIF is, they become more, not necessarily supportive, but like they are less in opposition. And so I think it's being used probably, you know, about the appropriate amount of time. The only time, so I voted against a TIF project once, and that was when there was student housing going into, I think it was like the old P.O. Pairs building. I'm blanking on the exact specifics, but it was student housing that was going down. And I asked, I called up a bunch of the student housing units, and this was before the pandemic, right? I called a bunch of the student housing and I said, can you share with me your vacancy rates? And I would be lying if I said I knew, if I remembered specifically which ones, because it was like 4 years ago, 3 years ago. But the vacancy rates, you know, weren't you know, extremely high, and there was still space available, you know, in the student housing across the city, on campus and off campus. And I remember I asked the developer, can student housing be rehabbed or switched into traditional family housing or some other sort of housing if it doesn't, if it's not successful or if it doesn't work? And again, 3 years ago, but essentially the answer was no, right? That might not be true anymore, but essentially the answer was no. And so I was like, okay, well, if we already have student housing, we have factual data that says that student housing is not at capacity. Is this the kind of development that we want to incentivize as a city? Whereas with, you know, things like Lincoln Bold, I know that there's this conception where folks have said a lot of these buildings are getting developed and no one's renting out, you know, no one's renting them out. And I don't have the occupancy rates for the private, you know, apartment complexes that have gone up, you know, recently off the top of my head. But I think one example is like 48th and Layton, right? I think the flats. I have had several constituents who would, you know, say, well, the flats aren't full. And I'm like, well, you know, I've been there, right? And I mean, these are filled up. Another one is the one that's across from Great Western over on Cotner. There's concerns about that going up, and said that no one's going to live there. And some people still will use that as an example of saying like, well, they'll say like, I don't know anyone who's living there, right? But I have constituents who've reached out to me who live there. So I think that kind of takes hand in hand the housing shortage information that we have to do better as a city on, and explaining what TIF is and doing a better job as a city on that. And I think that will kind of shift public opinion. Does that make sense? That's kind of a very long-winded answer, but I get a little nuanced in all of my answers.
Well, you had time. So we're down to the last question for you. James, what didn't we ask you that you wish we had?
One thing that I would like to throw out there also, because this escaped my mind, when we talk about attracting and retaining, folks here into our city. And another ordinance that I was able to successfully pass through the city council was my sidewalk cafe ordinance, which would allow, establishments to essentially serve on their patio. And this is something that we're hearing from folks. And it was essentially changing a regulation that just didn't make sense anymore. So I'm very proud of my track record on the city council. As I mentioned before, I've been able to pass more ordinances and initiatives than my colleagues, with bipartisan support and with a broad portfolio of initiatives. Some of the ones that I'm most proud of is the over $800,000 investment into Mahoney Park that's going to be creating an accessible playground for all citizens with special needs. And that's one that I'm most proud of. And I think that is a real example of what could happen if we have an engaged city council that is willing to create an agenda and put forward priorities and work to get things done. Because with a little bit of seed money from the city, it was like $100,000, right? Over, as a line item, and then, over 2 to 3 years, being able to match that with state dollars and private donations. I think that is a perfect example of really great things that our city can do to deliver for our residents. So that's one project that I'm extremely proud of, and one that I just think is amazing. Another one, like I mentioned with the sidewalk cafes, going through, and just because something's on the books does not mean that that is something that we should not look at changing, right? Sometimes regulations do not make sense anymore. And when we talk about the sidewalk cafes and saying that it has to be more than 60% of your income coming in from food, does that make sense anymore? And are we hampering businesses from being able to succeed? And in addition to that, my broad portfolio of things to get done, sometimes I've been the lone vote on issues, and I've never been afraid to take that position. And one example of that was when the council, I think it was in 2021, voted to ban signs in the council chamber. And so this is when we were having folks that were upset about the pandemic coming in and had signs up. And I think there was also some concerns about some social justice folks that were coming in and having signs. There were things on both sides, right? And the council felt that that was not good for decorum. I was a lone vote against that, because if someone's holding a sign in our council chambers, there was already rules in place to maintain decorum. And if that helps someone feel heard, and if it's not distracting and it's not hurting anyone, then we should be able to let them do that. I was the only vote on that. So I've been able to get things done and build coalitions. And I've also been the lone vote, which means that every vote that I take because I believe it's the right vote to do. And I'm not afraid to stick to my values and to stick up for my residents. One last thing that I'll say, and then I know we're kind of getting over time here, but one last thing that I'll say is the other amazing thing that comes along with being on the city council is not even just ordinances and initiatives that you can pass, right? It's the power that comes with having this platform and being able to be an advocate for your residents. So in addition to my monthly town halls, there have been other issues that I've been able to work with residents on. And one was with a resident who had moved here from another state. She had, I'm skipping over a bunch of details for time, but she thought that her property taxes were being paid. And she had a pension, and she had a retirement savings account. Well, she was a cancer survivor, and 3 years after she had moved here, she was getting a notice to leave her house. So I was able to work with her in order to prevent her from being essentially evicted from her own house, through the property tax actions that folks had taken. And we saw a case of that recently. Now, I wasn't involved with that case, but like being able to be an advocate for our residents, even outside initiatives and ordinances, is a real power of being on the council. And I look forward to continuing delivering results. And the other ordinance that I'd throw out there, or the other initiative, is my home visitation, being able to secure funding to make sure that every kid that's born in Lincoln and Lancaster County gets 3 visits by a registered nurse, which can help lower CPS investigation rates, lower ER visits, and reduce suicide rates because of postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. That is an amazing, amazing thing that we can do at a local level. And I look forward to continuing to deliver results over the next 4 years. Thank you for letting me go over my time.
All right, well, technically you didn't go over, you ended right at 30 minutes based on when I started the clock.
Perfect.
My small talk doesn't count against people.
Perfect.
Right. Well, James, thank you very much for spending 30 minutes with us. We appreciate your service and your willingness to run again, and we wish you the best.
Hey, thanks so much for your time, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, James.
Bye.